When someone loses a significant amount of weight, especially quickly, there's much bigger questions to ask. What is happening in their body? Are they preserving muscle? Are they protecting their bones? What happens to their metabolism over the long term?
When you compare diet and exercise versus a GLP-1 medication versus bariatric surgery, the percent of lean tissue loss is actually very similar amongst all three treatment options. So people can lose anywhere from 25 to 40% of their total weight loss in lean tissue. Now, lean tissue does not just mean muscle. It's bone, it's cartilage, it's water. It's basically all the different cells that are non-fat.
Today, we're talking about one of the biggest shifts happening in medicine and in health right now, GLP-1 medications. You know, over the last few years, these drugs have gone from being a treatment for diabetes to becoming one of the most talked about topics in weight loss.
If I'm doing all the stuff that the data supports and that we're telling our patients to do to optimize bone health, why wasn't it working for me?
I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Michele Pearlman. She's a board-certified gastroenterologist, obesity medicine specialist, and physician nutrition expert. Today, we'll unpack how GLP-1 medications actually work, what we're learning about their long-term effects, and how people can protect their muscle, bones, and overall health while losing weight.
He said, we need to stop just talking about these medications as weight loss drugs or diabetes drugs. They are metabolic reprogrammers. These are tools in the toolbox to make the process of losing and, most importantly, maintaining the weight loss a little bit easier and a little bit less painful.
Dr. Pearlman, thank you so much for being here.
And thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And so before we actually get into the GLP-1 conversation, I want to briefly touch on your personal experience around bone health and osteoporosis. You know, you said you've been diagnosed at age 39. And so can you kind of walk us through that experience from discovery until now?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I have been a bodybuilder off and on since I was a senior in college. And I remember for my first show, I literally lost 30 pounds in like a 3-month span, doing 2 hours of cardio every single day. They literally had to kick my butt out of the gym. And during that time, I had actually lost my period many times over a span of probably 10, 15 years. And we call that the female athlete triad. And we see it actually not infrequently. My perspective, and I think a lot of kind of females' perspective, is it's kind of, at least at that time, it was like a badge of honor. Like, I am lean enough to lose my period, or I am working so hard that I lost my period. It honestly didn't strike anything that was abnormal or something that I should be concerned about at the time. So I've been lifting heavy my whole life. My mom does have osteoporosis, so it definitely runs in the family. And, you know, the more that I see osteopenia and osteoporosis in my patients, you know, I actually wanted to get a bone scan. And the reality is that most insurance companies don't even start covering it for women until the age of 65, and then usually around age 70, unless there's other risk factors for men. But I went to my gynecologist and I said, listen, I have a family history. I would just like to get a baseline bone scan, because as we know, we basically maximize our bone density at the age of 30, and then it kind of stabilizes. And then during perimenopause, which could be in the mid 30s and beyond, is where we lose significant bone. So really, I think a lot of people should be getting baseline bone densities when it's at our peak, so we know kind of where we're starting from. So I went to my gynecologist. She kind of questioned it a little bit, but then put in the order, and I went to go get my bone scan. And so when I went to the appointment, the technologist did the scan, and he said, wow, your bones are strong. And so I left the appointment. I texted my mom and I said, Mom, great news. Like, my bones are super strong. I'm super excited. So then the report gets uploaded into my portal, and I see that I actually have a diagnosis of osteoporosis of the lumbar spine and osteopenia in the hips. And I was like, well, that can't be right. That doesn't make any sense. This guy said that my bones were super strong. I've been doing all the things that I counsel my patients in doing. Eating good protein, calcium-rich diet, optimizing my vitamin D, doing weight-bearing exercise, putting in my 10,000 steps a day. So I said, this couldn't be right. So I reached back out to my gynecologist. She tried to reassure me and say, listen, things, you know, people make mistakes. Sometimes the scan, something happened with the machine. We always just want to repeat it, right, if the results don't make sense. Mm-hmm. So I actually went to a different facility, and lo and behold, had the same results. So that was very eye-opening for me, right? If I'm doing all this stuff that the data supports and that we're telling our patients to do to optimize bone health, why wasn't it working for me? And so when I kind of looked back in my history and said what could have been the culprit, I think one of the biggest things is potentially the bodybuilding and being lean, overtraining, underfueling, and how that impact on hormones can play a huge role in bone development during those critical years, from the 20s and 30s.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And, unfortunately, it's a story that we hear quite often. You're thinking you're doing all the things right, and then you discover whether it's you're asking for a scan or, unfortunately, like a fracture too easily. That's when a lot of our customers or our audience discovers that they have bone loss. And so, you mentioned kind of advocating for yourself in a way. You had to kind of push a little bit for your gynecologist to order that scan. So how has that experience kind of changed the way, or not, how you encourage your patients to really advocate for their health in themselves?
Yeah, I think data is so important, and we can only track what we measure, and oftentimes we're missing such a big part of the important metrics that matter. So within the typical healthcare scenario, what are the things that we're measuring? Well, one, we're measuring blood pressure. And I live in Miami, so people are rushing to get to their appointment. We don't give them 30 seconds to chill, so we're checking their blood pressure. Most of the time it's going to be high, right? Because they were rushing to get in and they were going through the check-in process and whatnot. There's high stress. So we're checking their blood pressure. We're getting them on the scale, on just a normal scale that's literally just telling us how many pounds or kilograms they weigh. We're sometimes measuring their height, but often not. And I learned that can actually be a marker of low bone density, is if someone's actually shrinking. But how often are we actually measuring the height of our patients? So much of the time, I'm having patients that say, no, I'm 6 feet. And I'm like, well, when was the last time someone measured you? And it's typically the pediatrician. So oftentimes we're measuring blood pressure and weight, and that's how we deem someone whether or not they're successful or not, right, in their health journey. So if their blood pressure is high, we put them on on antihypertensive. If their weight is up, we tell them to lose weight. But we have no clue what they're actually made of. And that's where obviously the lean tissue matters, the visceral fat, really the body composition matters much more than just that number on the scale. But because that's the way healthcare is kind of created, and the numbers that we're tracking literally for decades, those things are ingrained in people's minds where it's not their fault. If that's as we as healthcare providers, that's what we think is important, then they're honestly not going to know any better. So I think a big part of it is education. You can only advocate for yourself if you know what sort of questions you should be asking, and that's super critical.
I love that. Like you said, at least baseline data, let's get those numbers, and maybe looking at different numbers than we typically have in the past so that we can make an informed decision.
And the problem is some of these things, they take time and they take money, right? So like when I started Prime Institute 3 years ago with my twin sister, my first investment was a Seika bioimpedance scale. So that's a medical grade bioimpedance scale that's not only obviously looking for water, but it's looking for visceral fat. So how much fat is around the organs, because that's what matters most. If people gain fat in their arm, it may not be aesthetically pleasing to them, but specifically like during perimenopause and women start gaining that menopause belly, where the body fat is distributed is really critical in overall health and disease. So it's measuring the visceral fat, so fat around the organs, that correlates with the waist circumference. And what I look at most importantly is the muscle mass. A lot of times I think as women, we have this mentality of we want to take up less space. We want to be smaller. We want to be leaner. And the reality is we should be looking at it. I want to be stronger. I want to take up more space. Someone, I think it was Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, made a comment recently that said, if we're not getting stronger every day, we're getting weaker. Like we're not maintaining as we get older. The decision is yours. You either get stronger or you get weaker, and you choose what your heart is, because both can be challenging.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And so this is a great segue into GLP-1s and the shift here. And so firstly, for those that may be not as familiar, can you maybe explain what GLP-1 medications actually do in the body and how they help someone lose weight?
Yeah, absolutely. So our body naturally makes this hormone. It stands for glucagon-like 1 peptide. So now with the whole peptide craze, I have patients coming in saying, Doc, put me on the latest and greatest peptide. And I look at them and I tell them, you are on the most effective, the most well-studied peptide on the market. It's called GLP-1, glucagon-like 1 peptide. So GLP-1, our body naturally makes this hormone. So when we eat, it starts with digestion in the mouth. So we have enzymes that are secreted from our mouth that help break down carbs specifically. We also want to mechanically break down the food. So that's where chewing is really important. That food bolus goes down into our esophagus and then into our stomach. And that's where a lot of the protein is digested. And then you have stomach acids and other enzymes that are secreted that further help break down that food. That food bolus then enters the small intestine. And towards the bottom of the small intestine in the ileal region, that's where this hormone is actually secreted by intestinal L cells, so GLP-1. That hormone is released after it senses food or calories. That hormone then sends signals back to our brain and it says, brain, I'm full. So it's what we call a satiety hormone. That hormone also slows down the rate at which our stomach empties. So it takes a normal stomach about 4 hours to empty a standard meal. What is a standard meal? In the trials is basically an egg sandwich. So 4 hours to completely empty. So this medication helps the food stay in the stomach longer. So let's say the food now stays in your stomach for 5 hours or 6 hours. So it can be incredibly helpful for people who eat a good meal and they feel satisfied, but then they're hungry about an hour or two later. So it helps keep them satiated longer. Now, there's probably 50 mechanisms as to how these medications work, most of which I don't think we quite yet understand. Those are the main ones. The other main ones is we have GLP-1 receptors in our brain, and so it helps kind of stun some of these reward pathways with dopamine. So you eat the food. Let's say you were to have a craving for a cookie, you eat the cookie. With these medications, it kind of dampens that pleasure response. Now, the goal with the medications is not to create food aversions. It is not to take away all your hunger. I do get some patients, it's few and far between, but they come in and they say, Doc, I don't want to feel hungry. It's an uncomfortable feeling. That is never the goal, because when people have no hunger, then they are at much higher risk for losing bone and muscle because they kind of have to force feed themselves. So the goal of the medication is to allow someone to eat good food, eat their protein, eat a high fiber meal, feel satisfied, and get rid of some of the food noise in between and knock down some of those hunger and craving signals that can sometimes be very significant for people and interfere with their daily life. And I also see it quite often actually in perimenopausal women where all of a sudden they're craving sweets. So I think hormones definitely can play a critical role in a lot of these hunger and craving pathways. But we're also seeing anti-inflammatory effects. So, these medications were initially developed for type 2 diabetics. This was back in the early 2000s. So people think these medications are brand new. They're not. It's just people recognize the Ozempic jingle that came out like in 2018. But medications in this drug class have been around since the early 2000s. So the first kind of injectable medication that we started talking about for diabetes was Victoza, and that's liraglutide. We started seeing people were losing weight, so they did additional studies, and then Saxenda came out. So that was kind of the first injectable GLP-1 medication. That was a daily injection. Then Ozempic came out in about 2018, and then the same medication, semaglutide, which is Ozempic, was Wegovy. And so Wegovy is for non-diabetics trying to lose weight. And that came out about, I believe, 2020 or 2021. And then most recently is tirzepatide. So that's Mounjaro for diabetics and then Zepbound for non-diabetics. So we have anti-inflammatory effects. They're doing clinical trials in autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. It's now FDA approved for diabetes, for overweight with a comorbid condition, or obesity with a BMI over 30. Zepbound is actually approved for sleep apnea. There are secondary kind of cardiovascular risk reduction medications like Wegovy, which are also approved for stroke and heart attack prevention. So we're seeing a lot more indications come out that actually go well beyond just diabetes control and weight loss. I think partly because of the anti-inflammatory effects.
Thank you for explaining that in such depth. And it's super interesting. And like you said, originally, it was helped to manage type 2 diabetes. Mm-hmm. Now there's been more research, more studies, and, it goes beyond weight loss, which I think there's probably that common misconception that GLP-1 and weight loss. And so, you could probably speak to it a little bit. What are the other misunderstood aspects of GLP-1 medications?
Yeah, I think people look at the commercials and they see morbidly obese, actors and actresses. And so they come to my clinic and they're like, oh, I'm not a candidate. And they absolutely are candidates. So I think one misconception is you have to be like morbidly obese to be a candidate. And that's not true. So I get actually plenty of normal weight individuals but they have visceral fat. All of a sudden, they're going through perimenopause. All of a sudden, they're diagnosed with high cholesterol and they're pre-diabetic. These things come out of nowhere. And that's because we know that hormones, both testosterone and estrogen, play a critical role actually in cholesterol metabolism and insulin regulation. So a lot of these quote unquote normal weight individuals are still struggling with these other comorbid conditions. By all intents and purposes, they may have a normal BMI or body mass index, and that's just based on height and weight, but they have high visceral fat or they have low muscle. So I still find that these medications are incredibly beneficial in those individuals because it's really attacking this underlying issue, which comes down to insulin resistance. I was at a recent longevity conference about a couple months ago, and one of the head guys who is a lipidologist, so a cholesterol metabolism expert, and he actually made a very interesting comment. He said, we need to stop just talking about these medications as weight loss drugs or diabetes drugs. They are metabolic reprogrammers. And I thought that was just fascinating because it takes away some of the stigma. A lot of people have this mentality of, I need to do it on my own, right, to lose weight. I don't want to cheat. I don't want to use a medication. And the reality is, it is not cheating. They still have to do it on their own. These are tools in the toolbox to make the process of losing and, most importantly, maintaining the weight loss a little bit easier and a little bit less painful. But it is a constant, daily, consistent effort that every single individual needs to make on or off GLP-1 medication to lose the weight, but maintain that weight loss and have optimal cardiometabolic health.
Well, and I think it's a great point you're making and alluding to that, it's not a quick fix. This is really a long-term treatment or like a new lifestyle for someone. And so you often talk about that sustainable health rather than these quick fixes. And so there can be, the misconception, like you said, that you take a medication, you lose all this weight and you're done. But that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, these medications were developed for long-term use. And what does the data show? The data shows that a lot of people actually come off the medication within the first year. Why is that? Well, currently the cost is still pretty cost prohibitive for a lot of people. Now, when these medications first came out, I had patients that were paying $1,500 per month. And that adds up quickly because remember, these are not just like 2-3 month medications. These are long-term medications. So over time, that adds up very quickly. Luckily, nowadays, the prices have gone down, and a big part of that are there's more medications on the market, so there's more competition, so it's driving down the prices of kind of the older generation drugs, which is great news, and I think it will only get better. But yeah, these are not short-term medications. What does the data show? That a lot of people come off within the first year, whether it's because it's cost prohibitive or side effects. There's many different reasons. But people tend to gain about 2/3 of the weight back after the first year. So just like with bariatric surgery, just like with high cholesterol or high blood pressure, if I have someone who has high blood pressure and I put them on a medication, if they then stop the medication, what is typically going to happen? Their blood pressure is going to go back up. Just like GLP-1 medications, antihypertensives, cholesterol medications, these are not cures, they are treatments. And when you stop the treatment, oftentimes the underlying disease process will come back.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, you describe the journey might look different for everyone, of course, but for those that are maybe considering bringing this up with their doctor, how do they approach that? And what does their journey potentially look like?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think now with social media and patients or consumers are becoming more well-versed on what the options are, they're really advocating for themselves. And I think podcasts are also a great way to educate people. I would say that a lot of the providers, unfortunately, oftentimes are not watching whatever videos are on TikTok or podcasts are trending. And so I've seen actually a pretty big mismatch where you have consumers or patients who are demanding better care and more nuanced care, more precision medicine. And you have some healthcare providers who have been practicing medicine for 3 decades and they're kind of stuck in their old ways. Or these GLP-1 medications, they don't have much experience, so they're definitely nervous about kind of delving into that field. And so you have a mismatch where patients are asking for it, and I don't want to say demanding, but they're asking about it. And then you have some providers who are saying, oh, you're not a candidate, you're not big enough, just do it on your own, just eat less and move more. You name it, my patients have been, told it by one or many providers. So I think it's, a big onus, unfortunately, on the patient is to find the right provider that they know specializes in this, and not all providers do. Not all providers are willing to talk about it. And the last thing we want is to encourage patients to go talk to their doctor, but then be gaslit. So I think really the initial thing is making sure you find a trusted provider that can have that conversation with you. And sometimes that's the most challenging part. Navigating the healthcare industry is incredibly difficult. At our practice with Prime Institute, that's really one of our roles with my sister and I, is our goal is to find the really good providers in the area where we understand what sort of patients they like to see, how do they kind of perceive medicine and these GLP-1s and longevity and cardiometabolic health, and make sure that we're the matchmakers, not leave it up to the patient to figure out who to see.
That's great. And we've said that before, even someone who has bone loss trying to match like a functional healthcare provider. And, sometimes it's not the first one. You might have to search and see, the right fit for you. And so, as more people are prescribed these GLP-1s, muscle and bone health have become such a hot topic around it. Not only in clinical settings, but like you said, in social media, on TikTok and Instagram and all the other channels. And so what does the current evidence though show about what's happening during the body with significant weight loss?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Everyone loves to blame everything and anything on GLP-1s. I mean, here's the reality. The press and the media are going to share the really good and the really bad stories because that's, for better, for worse, that's what the consumer, right, the viewer wants to see are the headlines, right? But the reality is most people do very well. They just don't have a very interesting story. So we're kind of skipping a lot of those people, right? We're bringing up, actresses and actors that look anorexic. And I'm not going to mention any names, but I'm sure you've seen them in the headlines. So people assume that everyone on a GLP-1 is emaciated and they're going to fall and just fracture every bone in their body, which is not the case, actually. So when you look at the data, it's interesting. When you compare diet and exercise versus a GLP-1 medication versus bariatric surgery, the percent of lean tissue loss is actually very similar amongst all three treatment options. So people can lose anywhere from 25 to 40% of their total weight loss in lean tissue. Now, lean tissue does not just mean muscle. It's bone, it's cartilage, it's water. It's basically all the different cells that are non-fat. Okay, so it's not just muscle. So, but that's across all modalities. About 25 to 40% of the total weight loss can be in lean tissue. So similar amongst all three. Now, why are people harping on the GLP-1s? Well, the reality is people are losing more weight on GLP-1s than they were ever able to lose on diet and exercise alone. So if you look at the absolute numbers, yes, people are going to lose more pounds or more kilos of lean tissue compared to diet and exercise alone because they're just losing more weight in general. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, like I mentioned, it's not 40% of muscle. About half of that, so half of the 25 to 40% can be muscle. But here's the critical thing. These GLP-1 medications, as far as we know, they are not disintegrating bone and muscle. These are not inevitable losses. So every single patient that comes into my clinic at Prime Institute, my goal is that once they reach their goal, which for many people is just losing about 10% of their weight. That's really all you need to improve cardiometabolic health, reduce the risk of fatty liver, improve insulin sensitivity, anywhere from 7 to 10% of your total weight. Once they hit that, my goal then is to really focus on body recomposition, so gaining back some of the muscle they may have lost. And I want them to be stronger than when they started and have more muscle mass than when they started. And it is absolutely possible, but it requires a strategy. And as much as these online platforms, and I'm not going to name any names, but all these online platforms that are quote unquote trying to improve access for people to the masses for GLP-1 medications, the reality is the majority of them are script mills. They are just writing scripts and they have no incentive to actually improve someone's cardiometabolic health. They make money off of subscriptions or memberships. So these lean tissue losses are not inevitable, but it requires a strategy. Patients need to understand how much protein should I be eating? How much resistance training should I be doing? Not all exercise is created equal. What sort of supplements should I be taking to optimize my bone and muscle health? So all of these things are critical. How to improve sleep, reduce stress. All of these things are a constant, daily, consistent strategy, not just taking a medication or doing what we call doing the job.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like what you said, quoting you, but it's just a tool in the toolbox. There are so many other things, as you mentioned, that need to go in it, and it's a full strategy to be able to accomplish those goals. And so I think I know the answer to this question, but should people that have bone loss, osteopenia, or osteoporosis, should they avoid these medications?
No, because what we also see, so when we see lean tissue loss or muscle mass loss, and I do see it all the time when I evaluate it once a month on my Seiko bioimpedance scale. Here's the reality is when someone has metabolic issues, whether it's insulin resistance, cardiac disease, obesity, they get fat infiltration of the muscle. So they may technically have more muscle mass on the scale, but is that muscle healthy, right? We don't know because the problem is most clinics are not actually assessing that. Most clinics are just getting you on the scale, or like in my clinic, I'm getting someone on a bioimpedance scale, but I'm not even doing like performance testing, right? I'm not doing a get up and go test. I'm not doing a 6-minute walk test. I'm rarely doing like a dynamometer test where I'm measuring grip strength. Ultimately, what matters is not necessarily muscle mass, but it's strength and performance, right? Because that's what matters when it comes to reducing risk of frailty fracture and improving our not only health span but lifespan is how well do those muscles contract and produce force and help us get out of a chair or help us prevent a fall, right? But most people are not measuring that. When someone loses weight, specifically when they're losing more body fat, or at least maintaining muscle, or even if the muscle is going down a little bit, you're actually getting the fat infiltration out of the muscle. So even if, by all intensive purposes, they have less muscle mass, oftentimes that muscle is healthier. You get less fat infiltration. Your actin and myosin, you get stronger contractile forces. So how do I assess it in my clinic? I ask patients, even if they lose muscle, I say, how are you performing at the gym? A lot of my patients have trainers and they say, I'm lifting heavier. I now, do shoulder press with 40-pound dumbbells. I started at 20. That's all I need to know. If subjectively and objectively they're feeling stronger and they're lifting heavier and they're feeling better, then honestly the number on the scale doesn't matter so much.
That's really interesting, and I haven't heard that before, because even myself, I have probably a basic version of that scale at home where it shows the water retention and the muscle mass, and I've been doing some recomp myself, but I've seen the muscle go down a little bit, but like you said, I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm lifting heavier, I'm feeling better at the gym, and so all things to consider when you're, doing this approach and this strategy.
Yeah, and I think data is very important, but I've been looking at a lot of things recently. There's been a lot of articles like in the Oura Ring, and I wear it too, right?
Yeah.
Where sometimes we're looking at the metrics so much that we feel fine when we wake up in the morning, and then our readiness score is 70 and we got a poor sleep score, and now we say, oh, I'm tired, right? Sometimes we're consuming the data that we're getting from these wearable devices, and then we're allowing it to actually influence how we feel. And remember, these are just data points, and these technologies are not perfect. They are going to be variable. It depends on if you ate out for dinner the night before, did you exercise, whether or not you're on your period or not for a woman. So these metrics are going to vary, and day to day, there could be anywhere from a 2 to 5% error rate depending on the technology. So we have to collect the data points to trend over time, but just realize if you're putting in the work and you're consistent, that from a day-to-day basis, you're going to get variability. It's looking at what is the trend this month and over the next 3 months and over the next 6 months. But you need the data points in between to obviously create those trends.
That's a great point. Let's not be committed to all these data points and look at the trends over time. Yeah. And so given your expertise, you're end to end really in the gastroenterologist field. And so I'm really curious about digestion, because you mentioned a little bit about stomach emptying and all of that. And so how do these GLP-1s affect that digestion?
Yeah, so I think, as a gastroenterologist, in my prior career, I worked at the University of Miami. I started their medical weight management program there. And so a lot of the patients that were seeing me at baseline had gastro issues to begin with. So they struggled with heartburn or like reflux, regurgitation, nausea, bloating, diarrhea, constipation. a lot of these conditions are actually obesity related. The more fat we have around our midsection, that basically acts as an external corset and will cause actually more reflux for people. So I would do, one of the reasons why I transitioned into my current practice is because I would, sign patients up for endoscopies. They're struggling with acid reflux. Bob wakes up from his endoscopy and he says, "Doc, what's wrong with me? I feel awful." And I would tell Bob everything looked normal. And Bob would look at me and say, "But I don't feel normal. What's wrong with me?" I realized that I wasn't really adding a significant amount to the field just by doing endoscopies. I enjoyed it, but I don't think I was furthering the field in any regard. And what I realized is, endoscopies and colonoscopies are incredibly powerful tools, right? They're, major reason how, why we're reducing risk of colorectal cancer and finding Barrett's esophagus, which is a precancerous esophageal condition. These are very powerful diagnostic tools, but they're looking at structural issues. They're not looking at functional issues. They're not delving into the nutrition. They're not explaining why a lot of people are struggling with chronic GI issues and maldigestion, malabsorption. They're looking for structural things, polyps, masses, ulcers, things like that. So a lot of people were struggling with that, and I couldn't give them the answer because in the typical healthcare scenario, we as healthcare providers get about 15 minutes to sit down with the patient, So by the time they're getting checked in, I'm getting a chance to sit down with them, going through their history. I literally have 2 minutes to go over their dietary recall. And then how in the world are we supposed to then explain to someone what they should be eating or counsel them on all these lifestyle changes? It's impossible. So what do? We give them a handout that says, go on an anti-reflux diet, basically cut out a lot of the things that they typically eat. Let's do an endoscopy and I'll see you back in 6 months. Nothing against the gastroenterologist. That's just the way that healthcare is set up. So people often are looking for second and third opinions because they can't get one opinion from their provider because unfortunately time and access are often the limiting issue. You could have the smartest provider in the room. If you don't have the time to delve into the details and talk to patients and educate them, then these things are it's just a vicious cycle. Oftentimes people are not going to get better. So digestion issues are very important. And over time, what I've learned is that what is equally as important as what we eat is how we eat, the dietary habits, how much we eat, how late we eat, how fast we eat, whether or not we're consuming liquids with our food, whether or not we're actually chewing our food. So a lot of people, including myself, will literally inhale my lunch. If we're not chewing our food properly to allow for proper breakdown, we're going to get maldigestion, and then that can lead to malabsorption. And so all these things can get worse on a GLP-1 medication because if I'm slowing down the rate at which your stomach empties and you're already eating fast, you're not chewing, all that food is just going to sit in your stomach and lead to more reflux, more bloating, more indigestion. So that's where teaching someone the dietary habits, optimal dietary habits on or off a GLP-1 medication are really critical. Now, when we talk about different macronutrients, fat is actually going to delay our stomach the longest. So I have a lot of patients that they like red meat, and red meat is fine in moderation. But starting an injection like Ozempic or Mounjaro or Zepbound, and then eating, a 16-ounce steak that night will not bode well because that fat, out of all the macronutrients, protein and carbs, is going to just sit in your stomach like a brick. So that's where, the dietary behaviors are really important on GLP-1 medications. If we know that the majority of people will have a GI side effect, we need to counsel people ahead of time before they struggle, before they're up all night with indigestion, on how their nutrition needs to change on a GLP-1 medication. And there are basic strategies that people can implement. It's just most people are not aware of them.
Thanks for explaining that. And I almost think we could probably have another episode just talking about absorption and gut health because you are just a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just sitting here and soaking it all up, and it's been fantastic. But, one thing that often gets lost in the conversation, especially around weight loss, is that we don't want people to weigh less, like you said. We want them to be stronger and stay strong. And so when someone starts to lose weight and, start that journey, what are the most important things that you recommend, like you said, to stay strong and be vital?
Yeah. So I always ask people, what is their goal? A lot of times people have this perception of when I see 120 on the scale, then I'm going to be happy. My life will be perfect. And the reality is, I ask them, what is so special about 120, 130, 140? And oftentimes that's when they were in high school or in college, when they didn't have kids, they weren't married, they had less responsibility, they didn't have a high stress career. They equate 120 with a more carefree life, right? And the reality is once they hit 120, they still have problems going on, right? So I try to reframe it in, what does success look like for you in the next 3-6 months? What do you want to be doing 2 decades from now? Because for many people, and most of my patients are midlife, so anywhere from 30s to 60s, many of them work their butts off. And so when they retire, they want to continue traveling the world and doing whatever they want to do. But if they want to go on a big hike at the age of 60, and they're not doing that currently at the age of 30, there's no way that they're going to still have that VO2 max capacity, right? The cardiorespiratory capacity to be able to hike mountains 30 years down the line if they're not being active today. So my first kind of goal is to figure out what is their goal? How do they define success? If someone just wants to lose 10 pounds, that's a very different story than someone who, let's say, really needs to lose 50 or 100, or, someone who wants to compete, let's say, in an Ironman or something like that. So, whatever I want for my patient, it really doesn't matter. My goal is to create guidelines and structure for whatever their goals are. And if I need to kind of reframe them to be more realistic, then I absolutely will. We can never negate the foundation, right? So with these medications, which are incredibly powerful, and retatrutide is hopefully going to come out late this year, early next year, where people are going to be losing upwards 30% of their total weight, things that we've never seen before. These are comparable to the gastric sleeve and Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. What are these critical things? We cannot forget the foundation. If someone wants to be healthy, not only 6 months from now, but potentially 6 decades from now, we have to protect our metabolic engine. And what is that? It's the muscle and bone. It's these musculoskeletal organs, which for so much of my career, I thought just kept us together, right? But what we're learning more and more is that the lower our bone density, the higher risk of things like Alzheimer's dementia. The more muscle we have, the more brain matter we have. The more muscle we have, the more sensitized our body is to insulin. The more muscle we have, the longer we live. The wider our quad circumference, the longer we live. Like, so many of these things that we look at as far as health metrics are tied to how strong our bones and how much muscle we have, which I've really learned over the past couple of years. So if people want to preserve muscle and bone, which, like I mentioned, is so incredibly important for our health span and lifespan, then we can't wait until we've already lost the muscle, specifically on GLP-1 medications, right? So what do we need to focus on? Protein is critical. And I know people are so annoyed about hearing protein, because that also is obviously trending all over social media. But protein is the only macronutrient our body actually needs to survive. We can survive without fat. We can survive without carbohydrates. It's not pretty, and most people are going to feel pretty tired, and our hormones are not going to be optimized, but we can survive. Without protein, we do not survive. Now, the key thing is a lot of people just aren't eating enough protein in general, right? They're having, let's say they're going out to eat and they're having a pasta meal. Well, depending on what type of pasta they're having, maybe they get 5 grams of protein. It's hard to say. Or if they're kind of splurging on the appetizer, which is like chips and salsa and guac, they're really not getting any protein. They're getting plenty of calories, but they're not getting enough protein. So I always try to figure out how much protein are people getting at baseline, and then I'll tailor my recommendations in regards to that. If someone's only consuming 20 grams of protein a day, then I'm not going to tell them they need to hit 120 from the get-go, right? I'm going to slowly increase it because I'm just going to be creating very unrealistic goals here. Now, the other key point here is that not all protein is created equal. I'm not going to throw this brand under the bus, but you can kind of see it here. Like pre-made protein shakes that promote or tout 26 grams of protein per shake, yes, they're getting you the protein, and that's a start. But when you look at the ingredients label, there's like anywhere from 10 to 30 different ingredients, and there's tons of artificial sweeteners in them, which are, when you talk about gut health, really harmful for gut health, and a lot of times will actually cause things like bloating and other sort of GI symptoms. So the first step is getting enough protein, and in general, what do we recommend based on the evidence? It's about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, so however much the person weighs at that current time. The other calculation we can do is 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. It's just a lot of people aren't quite sure what their ideal body weight is. So other really good options, if people say, well, I'm just not that hungry on the GLP-1 medication, how am I going to get 30 grams of protein? You can make your own. So I love things like Fairlife milk because they're high in calcium. They have more protein and less sugar than other milk. And they're also lactose free. It has the lactase enzyme that break it down, for which a lot of people just don't tolerate lactose. So if you added this and then you added, like a protein powder to it, or one of my go-tos is if you're doing a smoothie, add something like cottage cheese or plain Greek yogurt with frozen fruit and maybe some flax seeds or chia seeds. That's going to get you just as much or maybe even more than some of these pre-made shakes. So making smoothies can be helpful, especially if people aren't that hungry. In general, though, I prefer people eating their food and not drinking it, but especially on these GLP-1s, if people are not that hungry, especially first starting out with the medication, it's easier to consume your protein and calories in liquid form or blended form than it would be to eat 40 grams of protein in like a chicken breast type meal.
That's a great tip though too, because like there's a time and place for it all. Like you said, if we can prioritize a whole food meal, but if we need to go on the run, or like you said, you're just not that hungry and need a liquid instead, there are options. And so I think that's super helpful.
Yeah, and other great options, because not everyone eats a lot of animal protein, which is also fine.
Yeah.
I always have like travel friendly options for people who are either on the go or they have kids, they're looking for things to have at home, or they're stuck on Zoom meetings and they need something quick to eat. So I love options like roasted chickpeas. These get you 7 grams of protein. These edamame get you 11 grams of protein, or you could do like steamed edamame. So there's a lot of good options out there. Oftentimes just people aren't thinking about it. And going back to the gut health question, what is really important for gut health? Fiber. We need dietary fiber. So not only do people not get enough protein, they don't get enough fiber. And that's incredibly important to help reduce our risk of colorectal cancer and protect the lining of the gut, including our colonocytes. Do you know how much fiber we're supposed to be consuming in a day?
I don't.
Yeah. So it's about 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day. So if people are consuming more calories, it's going to be closer to 35. Lower calorie allotment would be closer to 25. So let me put that into perspective. About a cup of broccoli gets you about 4 grams of fiber. So if people aren't eating like 2 servings of like veggies or, fruit per meal, nuts, seeds, whole grains, there's no way they're hitting their fiber goal. So therein lies the challenge with these GLP-1 medications. How do we preserve bone, preserve muscle, optimize our gut health, feel satiated, stay within our caloric requirement, and hit our protein goals? That's where the challenge lies. I think when people think about these medications and they say, I'm just going to do the jab to lower my appetite, and when I'm not hungry, I'm not going to eat, they're successful up front. Most of them are going to lose the weight up front, but they're the ones that are likely to lose a lot of lean tissue. And then what happens? They gain the weight back in the future. And so if I have someone who's investing their time and money and energy into a true weight loss program or, weight management program, a cardiometabolic program, I want them to start adopting all of these things, because they're going to have to think about all these things long term in order to optimize their long-term success, not just lose 20 pounds over the next 6 months.
I think that's super insightful, and I'm glad we touched on fiber, because I feel like it's something that more and more people are talking about, at least on social media and other avenues, and putting that into perspective, the bulk, I guess, of like 1 cup of broccoli only being 4 grams of protein, or sorry, fiber. It just seems like, okay, yeah, we need to really get it right in terms of how to fuel and fuel properly throughout the day.
Yeah, we have to think about nutrition not as an afterthought, right? It is something that we do every single day, multiple times a day. It should be on the forefront of what we're doing, because it's, we often talk in medicine about the mind and the body as 2 separate things. They're one and the same. Our gut microbiome is our second brain, right? If we don't eat good food, we create dysbiosis, so bad bacteria, harmful bacteria, and those bacteria don't take care of us and they increase inflammation. Versus when we eat good food, anti-inflammatory food, eat good fiber, lean protein, we're promoting a healthy gut microbiome. When we have healthy bacteria in our gut, they protect us. Our gut is also, it's not only our second brain, it is our largest immune organ. And everything is connected. Whatever's going on up here affects our gut health and every organ below the neck. And whatever's going on in our gut also sends neurotransmitters back to our brain. So these things are so imperative that food truly is medicine. And when we do it correctly and eat a whole food plant-based diet, everything else falls in line. And that includes reducing risk of anxiety and depression and poor focus. Food plays such a big role in every aspect of both health and disease. But some really good options that I try to kind of teach people are, how do you choose options that have both fiber and protein, right? Because then you're basically killing two birds with one stone. So easy things like lentils. You can make it on a Sunday in like a slow cooker and make just a huge bowl of lentils and then freeze it, let's say, for the week. So these lentils, for one serving, okay, which is a fourth a cup of dry lentils, 10 grams of fiber and 10 grams of protein. That's easy. So that could be a very easy side, and now that could be a third of your fiber intake for the day. So that's real easy. Or you could like top it on, on a salad. The chickpeas, like I mentioned, get you 7 grams of protein, but also 7 grams of fiber. So these little things add up. The devil truly is in the details. The edamame gets you 5 grams of fiber, 12 grams of protein. I like these little chia seed bags. So these are easy to put in a yogurt or a cottage cheese or a smoothie, or even just like water with lemon. These get you just 2.4 grams of protein, but more importantly, close to 5 grams of fiber. So these little things really add up over time.
Mm-hmm. These seeds and legumes seem to be like a star, like you said, in the combo of the protein and the fiber.
Yep.
Wow. All right. So a couple last questions here. One of the challenges with bone loss is that it's often silent. They call it the silent disease. And something like a major fracture occurs, and that's how a lot of people discover that they have it. And so how do you specifically monitor patients who are actively losing weight, but with a bone health aspect in mind?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say aggressive, but maybe just more proactive when it comes to looking at musculoskeletal health, because I see the impact it has long term for people. Even though the guidelines may not recommend getting a bone density scan at the age of 40, I see a lot of perimenopausal women in their late 30s and early 40s. And what do we know during perimenopause? That's actually when bone density decreases significantly. So why in the world would I wait until a woman is 65 to check her quote unquote baseline? The highest she's ever going to be is at 30. And then at 35 or 40, it's already going down. What am I waiting for? Why are we surprised when 1 out of 2 postmenopausal women are diagnosed with osteoporosis? Then what options do we have? They get put on all these medications like bisphosphonates, which I absolutely think have a role. But then they're on these medications year after year, switching from one to the next, when we could have actually been much more preventive. So in my clinic, I'm actually checking baseline bone density scans in most of my patients, even in their mid to late 30s, to get a baseline. Now, what's interesting is I've sent several to endocrinologists in the area who are bone specialists, and they kind of not sure they love that idea, to be honest, because I don't think they know exactly how to counsel patients, because the typical like T-scores are age-based, postmenopausal, after the age of 50. So when I send them, a patient who has osteopenia, they're like, well, you don't really have that diagnosis because you don't really meet that T-score, the Z-score cutoff. But I had an interesting conversation with the endocrinologist recently because I had a woman who had like a Z-score of, let's say, negative 1.9. And it's not technically abnormal for a premenopausal woman until it's negative 2. And so I sent her and I said, I think she still needs a secondary workup for low bone density. And he basically said, what, your doctor's just ordering this because she wants to put you on like a bisphosphonate? You're too young for this and you don't meet the criteria. So I called him and I said, am I doing this inappropriately? I just want to make sure we're on the same page, that I'm not, causing fear in my patients when it's not necessary. And he said, here's the reality. Her score was negative 1.9. So technically she doesn't meet the criteria. But the reality is, if she were to go zero point 1 point less, it would be considered abnormal. So I think, the other issue with healthcare, we're all about numbers, right? And we're looking at ranges. And if people don't meet that specific cutoff, they are technically normal, but they are so close to being abnormal, right? Where we can start initiating preventive strategies before they get that diagnosis. And I think that's really where there's a huge gap, is what do you do for patients on the preventive side when they're so close, to progressing to the abnormal side. And by no means was I telling this woman she needed to go on medication, but I wanted her to get a second opinion. I wanted her to get the workup to make sure she didn't have something like celiac disease or she's losing calcium in her urine, all these other things that can contribute. And to start the conversation on what these women and men can do to help prevent the progression that happens to so many people unnoticed. So whether or not that data is going to help this woman say, okay, you know what? I actually do need to listen to Pearlman and get my butt to the gym, right? Sometimes data can be important. So people say, well, now I actually need to take this more seriously. Obviously, I have the conversations with every single one of my patients about eating protein, doing the resistance training, which we didn't talk yet about, but resistance training is like the biggest lever people can make when it comes to maintaining bone and muscle mass. But maybe that information was all she needed to hear to say, okay, yeah, I do need to be more consistent with my weight training. Yeah, I probably shouldn't be skipping breakfast. But I think far too often we've created these normal and abnormal ranges and we stick so much into those ranges that we forget to talk about what can people do now to help prevent the progression that happens to so many people.
And health isn't just black and white, like you said. There's nuance there. And so let's talk about resistance training quickly, if you don't mind, because you said, it's so important. We haven't touched on it. What role does resistance training play in all of this?
Yeah, I think, obviously we're talking about men and women here, and it's important, obviously, for all genders. But I think, specifically as women, we are kind of cardio bunnies when we're trying to lose weight, right? We go to the gym to lose weight. And the reality is we go to the gym to build muscle and get stronger. We lose weight outside of the gym, right? That's where nutrition is important, sleep, recovery, stress management. We lose weight when we're not at the gym. We go to the gym to build muscle, gain strength, and improve our health span and lifespan. That's kind of how we need to think about it. But we're, just telling someone to exercise more. I used to tell my patients that I just need you to move your body. And for many people who don't exercise, that is a critical first step, right? Figuring out what do they enjoy doing and what are they willing to commit to. So if I have someone that says, I only like hitting balls at the golf range, fine. That is a start. It's not going to be good enough for most, but that's a start to get them outside and get them to be more active. But what does the data show? It's really anywhere from 2 to 3 days of resistance training per week. Now, that could start depending on where someone's starting from. It could be body weight squats. It could be push-ups, like more body weight exercises. You're resisting your own body. That can be a start for a lot of people. Now, if people are already kind of doing some of that on a regular basis, then it's going to be, going to the gym. And for a lot of my patients, I really recommend they see a trainer. Now, I've been bodybuilding, like I mentioned, for a couple of decades now, on and off. And I only recently went to a trainer to get some mobility guidance. And I finally learned how to do a proper deadlift and actually engage the muscles I'm supposed to engage. So I think a lot of times we think, oh, if we show up to the gym, we know what we're doing and we're going to program ourselves and think that we have proper form. And the reality is people get PhDs and other graduate degrees in kinesiology and exercise physiology to understand exercise programming and proper form. We can't expect, all the mortals walking around to actually know how to do that ourselves. Now, the good news is there are apps out there. There are classes that can definitely help guide people. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not a fan of a lot of these classes. I don't know if you've tried like Orange Theory or Barry's Boot Camp. They're just like moderate intensive exercises and they don't allow for proper recovery in between. So they'll get your heart rate up, but they're more cardiovascular focused and less focused on legitimate strength training.
I like that you highlighted that there, that, you, in my perspective, may be an expert because you've been in and out of bodybuilding for so many decades, but wherever you're at, whether you're a beginner or intermediate or even advanced, there's probably some benefit to working with a trainer. Could be, like you said, mobility. It could be learning how to do these functional exercises and recruiting those muscles like purposefully in the right way. And for me too, I like it because accountability for a lot of others. And so there's so many benefits. And like you said, we can lean on others who are experts in their field to kind of really help us along in this journey because there are so many different pieces that we've touched on today. And so we're going to wrap up. Last conversation or last question here, Dr. Pearlman. What are the biggest things that people can do, whether they're taking a GLP-1 or not, to stay strong and healthy over the long term?
Yeah, so we have to address all of the pillars, and these are really hard to do, all of them every single day. but it comes down to having a strong offense and a strong defense. So what do I mean? What is our offense? It's getting optimal sleep. And so for most people, the data suggests 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep a night. So it's optimal sleep. That's when our body recovers. That is when our brain detoxes. Incredibly important for overall health. So adequate sleep, stress reduction. Now that's much easier said than done. And I once had a friend tell me, she said, you should do yoga. I said, I don't have the patience to do yoga. She said, you are the exact person that needs to do yoga. So I think even just, meditating, doing some deep breathing exercises, going for a walk outside, that can be very helpful for me. Kind of after work, I'll go for like a 10-minute walk. So making sure that we're managing stress and trying to manage our chronically elevated cortisol levels. Optimal nutrition. That doesn't mean we have to eat perfectly, but it's about making that next right decision. So instead of choosing like the Yoplait yogurt with 30 grams of sugar, maybe we're going to go for a plain Greek yogurt and then just top it with some fruit, nuts, or chia seeds. So making that next right decision. Moving our bodies any way we can, any way that we enjoy is a start, but ultimately focusing on 3 days of resistance training, and then cardio is really just extra. If time is limited, we focus on the resistance training. So that is really our offense, right? How do we stave off disease? And then the defense is trying to prevent the things that kill us. That's cardiovascular disease, heart attack, strokes, metabolic conditions like insulin resistance or diabetes, cancer, autoimmune conditions, and neurologic conditions like Alzheimer's, dementia. Now, obviously, we want to prevent all of those things. Obviously, sometimes we have genetic predispositions, but the way that we can really create a strong defense is by optimizing the offense, right? When we're eating well, we're managing our stress, we're sleeping well, we're allowing ourselves to recover, we're moving our bodies. That helps all these other things, reduce our risk of colorectal cancer and other cancers. When we are at a healthy weight, we actually reduce the risk of 13 different types of cancer that are related to obesity. When we build muscle, we reduce our risk of Alzheimer's, dementia. So as overwhelming as this may seem to so many people, like, oh my goodness, I have to be perfect, I have to have all these pillars every single day, the reality is we don't. It's just picking one thing. So saying, this week I'm going to tackle my movement and I'm going to aim for 8,000 steps a day. That's all I'm going to work on. Whatever happens with all the other pillars, I'll figure it out next week. Picking one goal, making it a habit, and then moving on to the next. And that can be at least, a much more quote unquote digestible way to kind of tackle a lot of these behaviors, which we know are incredibly important.
That's great, actionable advice. Dr. Pearlman, this has been fascinating. And I think the thing people should take away from this conversation is that weight loss is not just about getting smaller. It's about getting healthier. It's about getting stronger. It's about improving your metabolic health, your energy, your mobility, and your quality of life, while protecting the things that let you stay strong as you get older. And so, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone watching. If this conversation helped you or made you think differently about GLP-1s, weight loss, muscle, or bone health, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you next time.